Today we are launching a new element of Risk Matters called On the Road. This first podcast was shot in Washington, D.C. A very special thanks to our guest, Gene Ludwig, for appearing on Risk Matters from his office one block from the White House. Gene has a very rich track record in the areas of banking, technology, entrepreneurship, and social contribution, serving as Managing Partner of Canopy, CEO of Ludwig Advisors, Chair of the Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity, founder of the Promontory family of companies, author of The Vanishing American Dream, and former controller of the currency. Part one of the podcast is Gene's outlook on the banking sector. Gene, thank you very much for welcoming us today and for appearing on this episode of Risk Matters.
Arian, this is really a treat. I have a lot of respect for you, and so it's an honor to be on your show.
Thank you very much, Gene. And for our viewers, we can't really use just one word to describe you. You've been a regulator, you've been a businessman, a social activist, an investor. And so that's why we're going to focus on several areas today. But we'll start with banking. We're sitting about a block from the White House here in Washington, D.C. And there's a lot being made of the work that DOGE is doing. I think that everybody agrees that fraud, waste, and abuse is something that needs to be targeted. How do you see it? How do you see this matter? Also, given your experience in the federal government, and what's the best way to go about addressing this issue?
Well, this is a tough one. I like many of the things that President Trump has focused on, both in his first term and this term. They're really quite thoughtful and correct. In terms of directionally correct is what I like to say. But execution is the critical factor, as you know, in many businesses and government, all kinds of things we do in life. And how effective the DOGE is or not will depend on the execution. And it's a hard thing to do. My own sense is the reason they're doing it is twofold. There is no doubt that in a variety of areas, the one I know best is banking, there's a lot of right sizing that can be done, which will make actually the federal government operate better, not just more cheaply, and will help with our budgetary challenges like it would with any country. But as important as that is, and as valuable as it could be for the United States, it really depends on how it's handled. And it is very tough to take an entity as large as the U.S. and try to make major change like this over even a period of 4 years, in a way that actually is effective at the end of the day and doesn't destroy more than it creates.
When it comes to the issue of regulators and also the bank regulation here in the U.S., how do you see that, or rather, what should be the right way to address that? Is the amount of regulation appropriate? How should that be right-sized or aligned for the sort of current reality? And how do you see the Trump administration perhaps going about that?
Well, first, banking regulation in the United States is way overdone. I mean, we are way overregulated in the United States. And the reason for that, actually, to use an analogy, is regulations in any area, but certainly banking is a heavily regulated area, grow up like barnacles on a ship. If you leave a ship in a shipyard, these barnacles go up. And at some point, to get so many barnacles, the ship sinks. So I'm not saying we're ready to sink, but there's a lot of barnacles. With shipping, they scrape the barnacles off so the ship can, right, every year or 2 years they scrape it.
They just accumulate.
Otherwise they just accumulate. Unfortunately, there's no process in the United States for doing that. And looked at the moment, you would say the DOGE, in terms of what he's trying to do, is much more of a meat axe approach than a scalpel. And in banking, what you need is a scalpel, not a meat axe. But I'm not sure that's not the way it will end up. Trump is now just appointing his nominees for the banking positions. And his first nominee is a fellow by the name of Jonathan Gould, of course, who you may well remember because he worked at Promontory with us. I hired him there, and he worked with us about 5 to 8 years. I don't remember exactly. And he had been general counsel of the controller's office, where he's nominated to be the head, the controller, my old position. He's a thoroughly A-plus guy. And Jonathan is capable of using that scalpel and actually making the change. I also see no reason he won't get confirmed by the Congress. It's confirmed by the Senate, it actually does it, and be the controller. So that's a good sign.
So what should the banks be thinking about then as they restructure their compliance functions, or they try to look forward in their dealings with the regulators?
Well, first, banks, interestingly enough, are wary about this change. They should be dancing in, on air, have this, but they're wary because for them, there are two realities. One, consistency matters. In running any business, you don't want to have to keep changing.
Right.
It's expensive, it's disruptive, et cetera. So they're worried about that they do one thing in the Trump administration, then there's another administration, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that that they make the correct changes so things don't get less safe and sound or more complex or whatever. Jonathan, for example, is a good person to do it because he's a sensible fellow and he's a knowledgeable fellow. So it's off in a lot of ways to a hopeful start,
right?
In that regard, hopeful start. But if I were the banks in the United States, what I would do, which as far as I can tell has not been done, but I always advocate for it, is two things. Number one, I would basically come up with my own framework that meets the goals that the banks want to have to achieve. They have to be safe and sound. And they want to be safe and sound, right? You don't want to have a crisis. And now we have, if a crisis happens, for all the desire to deregulate, it'll be just like the Bush administration, which started out as a deregulatory environment and ended up as a super regulatory environment because of the crisis of 2007.
Yep.
You don't want that. So the first thing I would do if I were the banks, I would actually come forward with a proposed set of approaches, and then it's up to Gould and others to do what they do, but at least they see a framework. The second thing, which is I've been very hot on, but thus far not gotten a lot of resonance, is to deal with the supervisory process. Now, in most countries, you certainly do, you're an expert, Arian, but certainly in the United States, what impacts the banks and we call regulation is really two parts. One are the rules, the regulatory rules they have to follow. But the second is the examination and enforcement mechanism, which we call supervision. If you deal only with the regulations but not with supervision, you may not have changed very much. So the bankers have got to figure out a way, and Gould has got to figure out a way. How do I deal with supervision such that I have an effective examination supervisory mechanism, but not one that is inconsistent, goes overboard, et cetera, because that's what really can tie up the banks. In my view, there is only one way to do this, only one way. And that is to have an appeals process, an ombudsman. That's what the reason I believe this works is because I did it when I was controller, and we had the first ombudsman of any federal regulatory entity in the country, and it was so successful that the Congress mandated it for all the others. They passed a law requiring the unit we had, which adjudicated both formal and informal complaints. And I was very strong. I told anybody, the only way you'll get fired for certain at the controller's office is if there's ever any retribution of any kind for somebody bringing an appeal. It worked great. I think it improved our supervisory system. Banks won at least half the cases. It's valuable for the system to understand where you made mistakes, where you're wrong, and I think we improved because of it. But people don't like to hear the hard truths. and they don't like to eat their spinach. They like to eat cake and candy.
Right.
So
Right.
after I left,
Yeah.
spinach eating stopped, and so did the effective ombudsman,
Right.
which we do not have at any federal agency anymore. Oh, the ombudsman title is there, but they don't do anything.
Right.
So I think we ought to go back to doing that and have a stricter legal structure so that in fact it's ongoing and effective. But so far that's not top of mind for what's going on.
And I think, Gene, our European listeners, and especially the banks that always go through the supervisory process in Europe, would definitely welcome something like that in terms of being able to appeal, and that it's not just the regulator coming and telling them, okay, this is the thing, here it is. You can't challenge it. You can't do anything. You just have to accept exactly what it's like. Because I think it creates a very heavy regulatory burden, and it also spoils the relationship between the two parties. So I would hope that perhaps our European friends would take this suggestion on board. But let's see. We'll start with this. We'll start with this podcast. So hopefully it'll be the side of something else that they can review. Gene, when it comes to crypto, I guess the expectation is that the Trump administration will probably be a little bit more well disposed
Not a
towards
little
it.
bit. I mean, this is revolutionary. It's not evolutionary. The Trump administration is quite the advocates for crypto, allowing the banks to get involved, et cetera. And the Biden administration was exactly the opposite.
Yeah. How should the regulators go about that? So ensuring that this new asset class we can grow, and that the banks can also custody it or deal with it properly on the one hand, and then also have proper regulations around that, especially when it comes to compliance and money laundering and other issues.
Well, first, it is good for the crypto market, and many crypto players have said this, have advocated this, to have regulation for themselves. I agree with that. The problem in the United States has been that there has been a controversy between the CFTC, which is the regulatory agency for futures, that wants to characterize crypto as a future of some sort and be the regulator, and the SEC that believes it's the appropriate regulator. Now, historically in the United States, the CFTC has been viewed as more of a light touch regulator than the SEC. But having one of these parties clearly the regulator is, I think, critically important, because what will destroy the market and will change the opportunity here is another Blankman-Fried blow up. And so it's not in the entity's interest not to have a safe and sound environment in which to operate crypto. And the banking regulators allowing banks to get into this will have to be serious about making sure that that they're not increasing risk, because it's nobody's interest to do that.
Yeah. Gene, if you could just shift to Europe. Obviously, the financial crisis has had a different effect on the US and Europe. The European GDP is pretty much what it was pre-crisis, whereas the US GDP is almost double what it was. I think the market cap of the largest European bank is maybe 1/7 of what JP Morgan Chase is. Why do you think that there's been this divergence in outcomes between the US and Europe, that were essentially at par prior to the crisis, but the US, especially in banking, seems to have emerged much stronger from that period?
Well, first, as to say a word about banks and banking. Banks and banking are really a derivative, if you'll excuse the expression, of the overall economy. So that the growth of banking in the United States and finance generally has very much to do with the strength of the underlying economy. And as you say, the GDP here growth has been very strong, and that so the bank's well-being is very much a reflection of that. The second thing I would say is that the U.S. continues to be a very entrepreneurial environment, even in the banking space, which is so heavily regulated. And as you know, in the US, more than half of the financial activity is not handled by banks.
Right.
It's handled by the capital markets and other players. So the economy's been strong overall, and the banks reflect that.
And so on that issue, I guess one of the problems is also the allocation of risk capital within Europe, and the ability of entrepreneurs to access that capital, which is of course much easier in the US. What would your advice be to European regulators to free up that whole sector and to make entrepreneurship to sort of supercharge the whole entrepreneur space with a better allocation of risk capital?
Well, Europe has historically had a strong bank model and very little capital markets. The capital markets here in the United States have mattered a great deal more for the new companies' entrepreneurial spirit than the banks. Indeed, banks have even largely been prohibited from getting involved other than as lenders to new companies. That they can't typically take equity positions, for example. So equity capital has had to come out of the capital markets. But Europe doesn't have a strong tradition of that. Now, I'm no expert on Europe, though I've worked a lot with European banks, a lot, as you know, over the years. My impression is that notwithstanding the EU, which is a noble effort to have a common set of rules throughout Europe, culturally, the countries differ in a pronounced way, country to country. And, several of the European countries are very much big company oriented, and they're not as entrepreneurial as the US is. The US is still very much a cowboy culture.
Right.
And that is reflected in frontier culture.
Yes.
That's very much reflected in the business environment.
Gene, our last question on this is the post-World War II institutions, and Bretton Woods and the sort of cooperation, the Basel Committee and others that sort of come out for international regulators to be able to cooperate. Do you see those institutions changing as a result of the actions of the Trump administration and the cooperation between U.S. regulators and regulators in other countries?
Well, the degree to which the Trump administration really becomes, much more of an isolationist in long-term environment here in the United States, I think has been overblown.
Right.
I think, as I see it, Trump, who often overstates things in order to improve his negotiating position, vis-a-vis something like the European Union, more importantly, NATO, is really after a rebalancing of who pays for what.
It's a commercial transaction.
It's a commercial transaction. Right. It's a commercial.
Yeah.
Are we paying our fair share?
Right.
Are you paying your fair share?
Exactly.
So I think there's a rebalancing. But the one thing I would say about the international bodies is this: we live in a very dynamic world. Clearly, the world has benefited markedly by international bodies. At least I'm an internationalist myself.
Okay.
So I'm very pro these international bodies. But having said that, they themselves are going to have to change and modernize because we have such a dynamic, changing technological world that keeping up with the changes, I think it's going to be very, very important. And I think that's going to be the challenge for committees, for example, like the Basel Committee. The Basel Committee deals with first very hard issues. It's done a marvelous job, I think. I was on the committee for 5 years, and it was an easier time. In my day, at the Basel Committee, there were like 6 countries. I think it was the G7 plus 2 or something like that. So it was like around the table like this. You could have the whole meeting in a fairly contained setting, which is easier to manage than the current Basel Committee, which is quite a large number
Right.
of countries. And the larger it gets, the more you need different mechanisms to come to decision and actually consider matters, particularly complex matters like bank supervision in a really considered way.
Thanks, Gene.